The views expressed and the opinions given by the individual host and their guests do not necessarily express those of W Rock Radio and its sponsors. All shows are independently owned and broadcast for entertainment purposes only. Readers and listeners are advised that neither W Rock Radio nor its owners and agents shall be held liable for the content of programs. Website content and any audio produced and streamed by W Rock Radio is protected copyright and may not be recorded, rebroadcast, redistributed, or reused without express written permission from W Rock Radio.
2, 3, 4.
Sometimes we need to slow it down. Take a look around and breathe. 'Cause these times go by so very fast. Moments never last. Just breathe. Breathe in, breathe out. Quiet, be still, don't shout. Love is what it's all about. Sometimes when you feel you've had enough, living is just too tough. Just breathe. 'Cause you'll regret when these days are past. Your friend just seen your last. Just breathe. Breathe in, breathe out. Quiet, be still, don't shout. Love is what it's all about. Just breathe. Breathe in, breathe out. Love is what it's all about. Quiet, but still don't shout. Just breathe. Just love. Just love. Just love.
I would do it.
And here we go. Welcome to the Just Love Show. Good day, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, whatever time you find yourself in or not in. As we do every show, well, first of all, thank you for joining me. And sit back and take a deep breath and think about all the abundance in your life, because that's going to be a lot of what this show is about, is making you once again aware of all of the abundance that we have. And specifically, we're going to focus on one of my favorite subjects, the cannabis plant, with a dear friend and previous guest on the show, Paul von Hartmann, who wrote the book Cannabis versus Climate Change, and also has a new film out, which I'm looking forward to him sharing with. So if you've taken a deep breath and you've got abundance in your heart and you're feeling the love, before I bring Paul on, I want to let you know a couple of things that are on my mind that has got me kind of fired up this week. I was watching a show this weekend on National Geographic Explorer, and it was all about the lost civilizations in the Amazon. My great-grandfather, as I've mentioned on the show before, was Lakota. So the plight of indigenous peoples all over the world and their teachings and their way of life is near and dear not only to my heart, but intrinsic to my soul. And so I'm watching this show, and it starts off by telling of some conquistadors back in like the 1500s who got lost up in the headwaters of the Amazon and really didn't know how to survive for themselves. So a small group of them took off with the Dominican monk priest father in tow, and they started to make this, figuring if they headed downstream, they'd eventually make it back to the ocean. Well, they didn't realize that that little trip was going to cover about 3,000 miles and take about 8 months. So as they're going down the Amazon, the Dominican is making just intense, detailed notes about everything he's seen on these massive city-states that they're passing by with these massive highways that connect them, and these beautiful people that live there that are perfect stewards of land. They're doing these controlled burns so that they create this beautiful, some of the most stable soil in the world, literally the size of the country of France. Then they get through with their trip after they're seeing all these wonders, and the captain of the conquistadors, who had taken off from the rest of his crew, was charged with mutiny, and the Dominicans' writings were hidden for a few centuries. Well, this show followed basically trying to prove if what he had written was actually true or not. Well, the jungle had obviously, since in this time period, reclaimed a lot of the structures that they had hoped to find, expecting to find big stone monuments like they had elsewhere in the world, or like were built in Eastern or Western culture, or in Mayan culture, or in, say, Egyptian culture. But what they found as they started to research, do more research into his books, that pretty much everything was built from wood or clay. The bricks were made from clay from the Amazon. So all of this material would break down fairly quickly in the jungles. But as they dug, they found that everything he said was true, that there was a thriving community of literally millions of these city-states that stretched all throughout the Amazon basin. The reason that they were gone is because the Europeans, i.e. Western civilization, i.e. us, if you are like me, because I'm of European descent as well, had brought disease that they didn't have any immune tolerance for, and it killed 95% of their population. Literally, the blood of millions was on our hands. Now today there's maybe 350,000 of these people left, and all they want is to live the life that they've always lived, because the way they lived is sustainable. The way that they live works at one with the planet, works at one with the planet's ecosystem, doesn't take more, is not a parasitic relationship, but a symbiotic relationship. Well, they're now threatened, the last surviving remnants of these once great cultures that existed for thousands of years, far longer than Western civilization has been around, to bring us to the brink of annihilation, the brink of extinction. All they want is one clean river, because all the rivers are contaminated, all the fish there are contaminated. So they're trying to raise money to buy the headwaters, which unfortunately I doubt will happen, because water is becoming such a scarce commodity that I don't think the powers that be will allow that to happen. And it just broke my heart. And I realized that if you're rebelling against something, in some ways, well, you're the polar opposite of the conformist. You're still helping to keep a drama alive, this story that Western civilization is telling. And it made me realize that you have to take a page from Zen Buddhism. You have to choose the middle way, which is to step away, which is to support communities like this, learn how to live and be at one with the planet again. Which brings me back to the subject of hemp. This is another place where we've been horribly misled. We have not been shared the true history of things, just like we haven't been shared the true history of what we've done to the indigenous peoples all over the world. No one said, hey, here's a country for the atrocities that we perpetrated on you, or gosh, your great wisdom teachings, we need to keep those alive. No, because they run so contrary to Western civilization's teaching, which is mine, 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 he who has the most wins, instead of the chief is the least within the tribe, to make sure that his tribe succeeds, to worship the land, to accept your oneness with all. These ways of being are completely contradictory to one another, as is the way of being that a hemp-based society, a hemp-based civilization would be with the one that exists now, which is why people like the Hearst, who bought the machine that made it easier to process hemp fiber than cotton, which is like the Rockefellers, who, when Ford built a car completely out of hemp in 1941 and ran entirely on hemp fuel, was squashed. then prior to that car, Ford had used hemp in all of the door panels on most of his Model Ts, had a fleet of 10,000 that ran on hemp fuel. And all of this you can look up. And I suggest you do look up, because your leaders, if you listen to the people that are running for public office right now, they're not going to tell you this. They're still going to make you feel that even if you talk about marijuana, hemp, which are all cannabis plants, that somehow you're talking about something bad, something wrong. There is nothing wrong about this plant. This plant is the embodiment of abundance. This plant, to my mind, in some ways, and I've said this before, is synonymous, is the physical manifestation of love in many ways. It's this panacea of goodness. It's nutrition, it's clothing, it's housing, it's fuel. It cleans the soil. It puts terpenes back into the atmosphere. It cures our body, and it opens our mind. I could go on, but I will let somebody who's far more of an expert in this field than I am join me now, so we can discuss abundance. We can discuss the state of the cannabis plant, where we're at right now, what we as a community need to do different and be better at, and help him educate us. And then I want you, my audience, to go out, because I'm sure if you're listening to my show, you're somewhat converted already. I want you to go out and tell people to do their research to learn about this plant, because we're, as Paul will share with you in a moment, we're running out of time. And without a moment's further hesitation, my dear friend Paul von Hartmann, welcome back to the Just Love Show.
Hi, Kip.
Hi, my friend. How you doing today?
I'm doing marvelously. Thanks so much for inviting me to spend time with you and your listening audience. I am happy to share whatever I can with folks, and I presume you have a way that they can call in, perhaps, and ask questions or send you messages or something like that?
Well, yeah, we will be able to take messages. I get messages sent to me via the website. That's www.justlovemovement.com, or you can even reach out to either Paul or myself through social media on Facebook if you have any other questions. And this show will be continually aired for the next week. And then following this, I'll also get Paul a YouTube link that he can share, and we can keep this dialogue ongoing for as long as you're interested in talking about it.
Fabulous. That's such a great service to humanity, Kip. I thank you again, and am humbled by your invitation to return and talk some more about hemp. I just sent you a couple of links on Skype through their SMS service to my websites for the book and the video on Vimeo, both entitled Cannabis versus Climate Change. And I recommend that if people are interested in some very fascinating ecological relationships that haven't really been widely talked about yet, they take a look at the effect of cannabis in producing atmospheric aerosols, the fragrant terpenes that Kip referred to earlier, that used to be produced in much greater quantities before we cut down the boreal forests and killed half of the marine phytoplankton. The concentrations of those atmospheric aerosols is presently about half of what it was 50 years ago, which is a catastrophic decline in boreal forests and marine phytoplankton, but it's also a catastrophic decline in the atmospheric aerosol concentrations of the Earth, which protect the Earth from the sun. The UVB radiation from the sun is deadly and causes geochemical shifts, and synergistic relationships are fundamentally affected that science can't even begin to keep up with, let alone document and study. So what what the point of my book and my film is to recognize cannabis as essential rather than considering it illegal.
I want to back up just a little bit, Paul, because I want to, for people who didn't hear you, and we have a lot more. I think the last time you were on the show, we were just starting out, and we had like maybe 5,000 or so listeners, which I was truly grateful for. Well, we now have 129,000 listeners as of last count. And I want people to understand who Paul von Hartmann really is. I want people to understand that Paul has been a lifelong crusader for the environment and for all life on this planet. Before he started doing hemp, he was with Sea Shepherd, the director of Sea Shepherd over in Hawaii, which is a Greenpeace type organization, and Paul can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But I wanted, Paul, if you could just really quickly, if you could share a little bit about your transition from Sea Shepherd to the hemp movement and why you've spent, and you thanked me for this show. I want to take this moment to thank you for the 25 years of your life that you have sacrificed for the greater good of us all in trying to get this story out and trying to help us awaken to the tremendous abundance and tremendous good that this plant can bring to humanity.
Well, thank you, Kip. I guess, I kind of had to stop working with Sea Shepherd because the issues that I was working on were so painful to witness and to research and to accumulate, arguing points and statistics on. It was really painful for me to have to deal with atrocities that people have committed against the whales and the dolphins in particular, but the marine environment in general, and the natural order, just as a matter of commerce. I always said, when I was in Hawaii, I said, if you can come up with another way to pollute the environment of Hawaii, you could be endlessly wealthy. So it's just, it seemed like that was the object of the game there. And when I learned about the value of cannabis in making different forms of energy, I suddenly understood why marijuana was prohibited, because energy is a multi-trillion-dollar industry. Marijuana is a multi-billion-dollar industry, but trillions are bigger than billions. So that is what directs our social evolution, unfortunately, is the potential for cannabis to displace fossil fuels and nuclear power from our economic systems. We don't need them. We can grow our energy. We need to grow our energy from the soil. And cannabis is the only crop that produces sustainable energy and complete nutrition from the same harvest, from the same field in the same growing season. It's the only crop that does that. And if that single fact were commonly known or commonly appreciated, people would be able to understand why cannabis has never been truly illegal. It's never been within the rightful jurisdiction of the court, because it's essential. It's too valuable to create a shortage of. And the reason we're facing climate change and many other symptoms of systemic imbalance is because we've been cut off from an essential resource for 78 years. And it's just to the point now where we either need to recognize our mistake and do everything we can to resolve it, or we can just pretty much kiss this planet goodbye before the end of the century. I
want to share, just so people understand, that it's not just a couple of radical hemp guys, cannabis guys here, spewing stuff about things that they want to get high from, which isn't the case at all. But this is a quote from Henry Ford that Paul and I were talking about earlier. Why use up the forests, which were centuries in the making, and the mines which required ages to lay down, if we can get the equivalent of the forest and mineral products in the annual growth of the hemp fields? This was Henry Ford. So you can understand the sort of battle that someone like Paul or myself has been up against. If Henry Ford couldn't stand up to the forces of the Rockefellers, the Hearsts, the DuPonts, all of who knew that this plan, as Paul just pointed out, would replace the petroleum-based economy, and even beyond that, would replace the economy of war.
Well, exactly, and it would also eliminate the economics of the global drug connection, which is what Peter Dale Scott writes about, where the CIA is deeply involved in the drug trade, and the governments trade in drugs through banks that are protected from investigation by political figures who suddenly shut down any sort of credible inquiry into where the money comes from for things like the Bay of Pigs invasion and other, Air America activities. Those kinds of things are just completely unacceptable, and yet it is almost common knowledge that they occur. I'd like to read just one sentence from Deep Events and the CIA's Global Drug Connection by Peter Dale Scott. This is just so revealing of why cannabis prohibition is being imposed. Quote, and in the 1990s, Dennis Dale, having retired as a top DEA investigator in the Middle East, told an anti-drug conference that, quote, in my 30-year history in the Drug Enforcement Administration and related agencies, the major targets of my investigations almost invariably turned out to be working for the CIA.
Wow.
When you understand that hard drug use goes up, becomes epidemic in the absence of cannabis at affordable prices, then you begin to understand how insidious the resistance to ending prohibition is. This stuff with the CIA has been going on since World War II. And so when you see the depth of corruption in our political system and how it has really been tied to our warped values, where we look at the value of a toxic chemical and we see that as being more valuable than an organic agricultural resource, you can see the distance from where we are to where we need to be very, very clearly. We need a pivotal polar shift in values from cannabis is illegal to cannabis is essential.
But
and we need to...
But Paul, what would the drug rehab industry do if people weren't getting addicted to all these other substances? What would all these law enforcement officials do if they didn't have the war on drugs? I mean, come on.
Well, they would save a fortune on alcohol and cigarettes.
Both of which are way more, alcohol, cigarettes, number 1 and 2 on cost to society. Heroin, number 3 because of prescription drug abuse. And cannabis, 114 last time I checked.
Yeah, it's the thing about cannabis is there's so many different uses of it. I mean, it spans every discipline and every aspect of our existence. It really is our functional interface with the natural order, because it is embedded in our physiology, in our endocannabinoid system. We make cannabinoids. The human body has the highest concentration of cannabinoids in breast milk. And without it, there's a failure to thrive. So, we have to appreciate that this plant has been on the planet a lot longer than we have. It's 35 million years old. And it is, it sort of brought us into the natural order as gently as we would go, and helped us wherever it could. until we finally got to the point where we thought we were so big and bad enough that we could do without it. Well, we tried doing without it for 78 years, and that hasn't worked out so well. We have the worst economic disparity. We have chemical pharmaceuticals in the drinking water. We have, just every sort of a screw up you could probably associate with adolescence. We're an adolescent, evolutionarily adolescent species that's tried to rebel against Mother Nature, and we haven't done so well.
We've got a few problems that we need to correct, and cannabis might be the solution to a lot of them?
Well, it's a good place to start because it is so fundamentally important. And time is the limiting factor in the equation of survival. So what we need is a fast-track protocol, and I just happen to have one right here. It's called Essential Civilian Demand. And you've heard me talk about it ad nauseum, as have most of my friends and family who haven't disowned me by now. But the fact is that we have what we need to achieve what we must. And essential civilian demand means what it says. It's the demand for something that is essential. And as Frederick Douglass pointed out in 1857, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. And so we have a demand in Executive Order 13603 and in the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR 44, and several other federal documents that have to do with emergency preparedness. I think we can all agree that we're well justified in claiming that we need to be prepared for emergencies that we can see clearly coming at us much faster than we can anticipate, with several extinction level events that are possible right now.
And that's one of the things that I wanted us to talk about, because I've been involved with disaster preparedness for about 30 years, and I was always a little bit torn when I was, dealing with disaster preparedness products, because it felt a little bit like vultures circling a dead carcass, and hey, I've got some doomsday stuff to sell you. But the fact of the matter is that might have been wrong-headed thinking on my part. People need to wake up to how things are working, how we're having an effect on the planet, what we're actually doing to ourselves, things that at this point would be pretty tough to change. Things like that we're going to have 9 billion people on the planet by 2050. This is a fact. We need to deal in facts. Things like, by even moderate estimations, we're going to have 16 to 17 inches of sea level rise in about that same time period. And that would mean, for someone like me in the Bay Area, and I've mentioned this on the show before, this would mean that the eastern end of the Bay Bridge would be underwater. Our brand new multi-billion-dollar Bay Bridge. This would mean that the Oakland and San Francisco airport runways would be underwater. And that's just to name a couple things. I'll let Paul take it from there and fill you in on some other facts that you should really, and anything that Paul and I are talking about, I encourage you to research for yourself. If nothing else, the internet is a vast library of information that you should really choose to avail yourself of. Don't wait for Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton or any of them to tell you what to think. Think for yourself, because they're not going to tell you the truth, because they think in some cases it will cost them votes, in other cases it's going to cost them their relationship with their donors who help them get elected, but you're not being told the truth.
Quite so. And I should mention that the reference section in my book has references to relationships that haven't necessarily been embraced by the mainstream scientific community yet. But if you read a study that talks about the effect, for example, of UVB radiation on the solubility of mercury, arsenic, and selenium compounds, And then you read a study that was done by the United Nations on mercury. It's mercury, time to act. And in that study, the tissue samples from cetaceans, from the whales and dolphins up in the Arctic, were reported on. And it was mentioned that the levels of mercury in these tissue samples was higher than one would expect from the ambient levels of mercury in the environment, which there was, because there's mercury in the environment everywhere as a result of burning coal and other things. And so, it became obvious to me that I read that and I thought about that, and I thought, well, okay, well, the reason that the levels of mercury in the tissue samples are higher is because the solubility of mercury in the Arctic is greater. The bioavailability of mercury is greater because the UVB radiation in the atmosphere at those latitudes is off the charts. And it is of enormous concern because that's where the marine phytoplankton congregate. That's where they breed. And those are the organisms that are making the atmospheric aerosols that are blocking the UVB radiation. So there's what's called a positive feedback loop, to where, cause and effect is going in the wrong direction. And we are completely oblivious to these relationships because, for a number of reasons. First of all, it's not right in front of us. But secondly, it's interesting to see how scientists are so focused in their area of expertise that they don't really bridge the disciplines.
You want to know what's really funny on that point, Paul? Sorry to interrupt you. Just something that I was listening to over the weekend. They were actually talking about specifically that scientists who become so focused on one discipline that they don't really even think about the cause of the work or the effect of the work they're doing. A few years back, they had done interviews or a survey of Livermore Labs, which is a nuclear weapons development facility out in Livermore, California. And they asked them what the worst part of their job was. Do you know not one person, not one of those scientists, and these are above average intelligent people, not one of those people said, I make bombs to kill people? Not one of those people said, I make weapons that can annihilate all life on this planet. Said, my computer's not fast enough. I'm not happy with what I'm getting paid, whatever. Not one out of all the scientists that they interviewed mentioned the fact that they were making weapons to kill people, and how do you sleep at night?
Well, that's disappointing, but not surprising. I mean, human nature is what it has to be in order to survive. And those guys are, unfortunately, they're committed to a way of thinking that doesn't allow that type of, broad perspective on what they're doing. What is interesting for me is that, I'm a photographer. Basically, I make photographs. I've done some investigative journalism, and I do have a background in life sciences. I graduated from Humboldt State in 1978 with a special major that included a lot of life sciences and ecology and population dynamics and things like that. But basically, I'm a photographer, and it was great. I was interviewed on the radio in Hawaii, and Jeff Davis, my friend, asked me, he said, how come you're bringing this to people's attention and not some, scientist from MIT, And I said, well, because, a scientist at MIT will be sanctioned if he talks about cannabis, or if he goes out on a limb and says that the terpenes in the atmosphere are part of the purification of the hydrologic cycle, which is another huge dimension of that is equally important.
And I'll tell you a personal story that will further back up what you're saying. If some of the scientific terminology or whatever isn't connecting with people's hearts, we're now, as a lot of you know, I created the show, or was one of the creators of the show Weed Country for Discovery. Now we're shooting the follow-up to it called Breaking Bud. And one of the young men that is involved with the film, named Andrew Moore, has really severe epilepsy. I mean, life-threatening adult epilepsy. He's 19 years old. He was getting ready to go into be the first adult candidate, or specimen, if you will, to do a study of the effects of high CBD cannabis on adult epilepsy. He was all ready to go. It was supposed to start this month. They put it off for a year. He doesn't have a year. He's having grand mal seizures maybe once a week. And what a grand mal seizure is, for people who don't know, it's a seizure where you lock up so bad it can literally cause you to suffocate, swallow your tongue, all sorts of things, but ultimately it can lead to death. And so I reached out to some doctors in the cannabis community and just asked them, I just said, can you just monitor him? I just don't want to give him CBD without someone, a professional, tracking this for us, so that we can then maybe turn that information over at a later date to other researchers. And they flat out turned me down here in California. Now, if he went to Colorado, he could do it. But in California, even the recommendation doctors that I talked to, because of exactly what Paul's describing, would not help this young man.
That's unconscionable. I mean, there's so many things about cannabis prohibition that have created unconscionable circumstances. The death of Alexandria Hill, beaten to death in foster care after she was taken away from her parents because they smoked a joint. I mean, the atrocities that are beyond imagining are commonplace in the context of the drug war. And that's another example where, you have to just shake your head and say, how can that be? How can that be happening? Shona Banda out in Arkansas, I think it is, her son was taken away from her because at school he expressed what he knew about hemp that didn't jibe with what the drug education person at the school was saying. And so her son was taken away from her because he was smarter than the people that were trying to indoctrinate him into the drug war. And, it just basically has become one unacceptable atrocity after another. I have my personal friend who I worked with for 15 years died in a hospital rather than at home because he couldn't have access to cannabis medications while he was in the hospital, and the hospital wouldn't give him the painkillers, the morphine painkillers, injectables that he needed out where he lived, out remote in the hills. And so he had to choose between dying surrounded by his family at home or going into town to the hospital in order to access the morphine, and he couldn't take the pain, so he went to the hospital and died there. But it's wrong that people don't have access to cannabis in a hospital situation. Even now, he was not allowed to take the cannabis concentrates while he was in the hospital. That might have made the difference between life or death.
Well, and what a lot of people don't know is just it's only been within the last, say 3 months, within the last 3 months, if you were using cannabis and you needed an organ transplant, you could not get your organ. So you couldn't use the medicine you needed to deal with the pain of whatever you were suffering from, whatever was causing your organ failure. And you would have to not use it for at least a month for it not to be in your system. But they wouldn't deny you your organ that would keep you alive if you use cannabis until 3 months ago.
Well, it's definitely, part of the stacking of the deck against something that people can grow in their backyard. That it's a corporate decision to ban a competitive resource, and it is so morally reprehensible that it's I mean, I read historical accounts of things that were equally reprehensible and atrocities in history, such as slavery during the Civil War, before, during, and after the Civil War, that really haven't changed very much. And the drug war is sort of the template for slavery, in that it is a war against nature, which is on our side, actually. And the truth is, I mean, our species is far beyond its rightful authority in legislating scarcity of a unique and essential natural resource that other species also depend on for their survival. We're not the only species that needs cannabis. Other species also depend on cannabis for survival. The nutritional value of the seeds is unique and it's essential. And so where do we come off creating a scarcity of it so that the animals and the creatures that we share this planet with don't have access to it? You know, it's a huge point that is very underregarded. We're a very very homocentric species, and
well, we are completely homocentric. We've become entirely enamored of our own belly button. We look out at our creations now and we think they are just the most, that we are our reflection, our cities that are, poor imitations of mountains, our telephone poles and telephone wires that are poor imitations of dead trees. You can go on and on and on. It used to be, in more ancient cultures, you'd look out and it was the universe you marveled at. It was nature you marveled at. Now we marvel at ourselves, and that's a large part of the problem, is this homocentric view we have of everything.
And it's analogous to an adolescent, combing his hair in the mirror, just totally enamored of himself, while the house is burning down. And whereas when he was a young species, he was all about mom and dad and thank you so much for feeding me. And now he's gotten to be a teenager and he thinks he's hot stuff and he's got a hot car and all this technology to play with. And we're really irresponsible. We're an adolescent species that is going to get spanked.
That was a truly brilliant analogy.
And I'm just sorry that future generations are the ones that are going to suffer the worst, because it's already horrible in many parts of the world, and it's not going to get better unless we initiate these agricultural protocols.
But this really goes back to the founding of the country. This really goes back to the founding of the country, doesn't it, Paul? Where the founding fathers were just adamantly opposed against the cannabis plant entirely. I mean, this all started with them, right?
Right. Yeah. What's fascinating is that the opinions of the forefathers, all of whom were hemp farmers, are so diametrically opposed to the misleadership that we have today. I mean, it's not a slight difference of opinion. It's one extreme and the other. And the fact that Washington and Jefferson were so enamored of the cannabis plant and recognized its values, it is kind of funny now, because they didn't know a lot about the value of the plant. They evaluated it for certain things, and they already recognized it as being essential. So it was, it's really, like you say, a situation where we've been dumbed down, and the shift in our values as a species has taken us into an area that is unsustainable. It's indefensible. It's untenable. It's just, and it's self-contradictory. I mean, the drug war is counterproductive to its own stated objectives. And so, where's the credibility? And in the absence of credibility, where's the obligation to obey? How rotten does a law have to be before people are obligated to disobey it? We've reached that point many times over with cannabis.
When we were talking before,
and I wrote the limit of law.
When we were talking before the show started, I wanted you to share the quote from Jefferson, just so that people, if they were looking up quotes, they could actually see what the founding fathers said about, or the forefathers said about hemp. I.e. cannabis.
Oh, sure. I actually, in my book, Cannabis versus Climate Change, I share 2 quotes of Jefferson's right in a row, because if you listen to both of them in succession, then a third truth becomes obvious. And the first quote is, and this is from Thomas Jefferson, 3rd President of the United States, a cannabis farmer. He said, "The greatest service which can be rendered any country is to add a useful plant to its culture." The second quote is, "Hemp is of first necessity to the wealth and protection of the country." And so the corollary conclusion to those 2 quotes is, the greatest disservice which can be rendered against any country is to remove the most useful plant from its culture. And cannabis is the most useful plant. For a number of different reasons, that's true. But the fact is that there's no greater harm that can be imposed than to prohibit cannabis.
And to highlight that point, Paul, and really put a punctuation on it, this is from the cover article in Popular Mechanics in 1938. Hemp is the standard fiber of the world. It has great tensile strength and durability. It is used to produce more than 5,000 textile products, ranging from rope to fine laces, and the woody herds remaining after the fiber has been removed contain more than 70% cellulose and can be used to produce more than 25,000 products, ranging from dynamite to cellophane. Popular Mechanics, The $1 Billion Crop, 1938. What happened?
Well, there was a petroleum boom going on, and the petroleum industry and the timber industry recognized that their greatest competitor was the farmer who could grow fuel, alcohol fuel, from hemp, and that hemp was the premier biofuels crop that was in competition with the fossil fuels industries, the coal and the petroleum, which, the fact is that all of those things are known now. We can look back and see exactly how we got into this situation we're in, and a lot of people have written wonderfully about that. I didn't include a lot of history in Cannabis versus Climate Change, because I really think that our cannabis legacy is more relevant than our cannabis history, even though, the one does have a lot to do with the other. The fact is, we need to figure out where we're going to go from here. And looking back on how we got into the mess that we're in is a valuable exercise. But people really are advised to embrace the good news. The good news is that there is something that we can all do to reverse climate change. And I still believe, even though it may be Pollyannish, I really think that we can reverse climate change. I think the worst thing that we can do is to underestimate the capability of this plan. What we need to do is we need to apply our military-industrial complex to farming cannabis in the deserts and expanding the arable base, essentially going from armies to farmies. And as you say, we need to go from being a parasitic species to being a symbiotic species, recognizing that if we don't, we're just going to get slapped.
And there is historical precedence for this. Granted, it was turning industries into armies or whatever during World War II. We stopped what we were doing to come together to battle for a good cause, which was the destruction of Nazi Germany. So there is precedence for us to put all of our stuff aside and come together for the greater good. And we can do that. And I think you're absolutely right that to underestimate the potential for this plant that it can do as far as helping us right so many of the things that we've gotten slightly off track on are huge. The only reason I think that history is important, and I wouldn't feel it was so important if it wasn't being left out of every conversation that's being had, is that it would give people, if you had some of our current political leaders standing up and saying, hey, here's what Thomas Jefferson said, because they love to misquote the founding fathers all the time, or just throw them out as reference points unrelated to the things they're talking about most often. But if they got up and said, hey, this is what Thomas Jefferson said, this is what Henry Ford said, I do think it would be impactful. In just the same way that I believe that people would have a much greater empathy and sympathy and understanding of why we're where we're at with the Middle East if people actually understood that the reason the Middle East is where it's at today is entirely our fault. After World War I, we divided up again for oil, we divided up the entire Middle East into the countries. Granted, the borders continue to change, but we set up the Middle East as it is today. Then, with regards to a country like Iran, which Obama, to his credit, did try to point out early on in his presidency, we overthrew a duly elected leader of their country, democratically elected leader of their country, in Mossadegh in 1953. It was Theodore Roosevelt's grandson, Kermit Roosevelt, that did that. And it was they convinced Eisenhower to do it because of the communist scare that Mossadegh was too old. We reinstalled the Shah in power, who was a brutal dictator, like every dictator in the Middle East, after they'd already kicked his father out. So I think sometimes, while I do agree with you that it's important to look forward, be positive, look at the upside to everything, I think if the problems are still going on and there isn't a historical perspective for people to understand why these things started, I do think that there is a service in helping people to understand the history of things.
I totally agree with you. I didn't mean to imply that history was not important whatsoever.
Oh, no, I know. I was just sort of emphasizing
that to stop with it. The Hemp Industries Association and Vote Hemp have their Hemp History Week, and when they first invited me to participate in that, I said, well, you guys, hemp history is great, but how about hemp legacy? If we don't make sure we have a hemp legacy to pass along, then we're not going to have a hemp history. We're not going to have any history because we'll all be gone. And so I believe that people need to familiarize themselves with the historical degeneration of our relationship with the cannabis plant and the reason that it happened, but the point of arrival is in establishing the forward momentum to overcome the inertial resistance to cannabis that has been imposed by an irrational social prejudice based on fraudulent assessment of THC.
Completely fraudulent.
THC is supposed to be dangerous. In fact, it's critical to our health. So it's a situation where if we shift values at a very sort of homeopathic intellectual level, then the reverberations of that shift in values is enormous. And
we've got about 2 minutes left in the show, and I want to make sure that you give out where people can find your book, and also if you're able to share the link to your new film. It was really wonderful documenting your journey in the cannabis movement. But I also want to touch on really quickly in the few seconds we have left. Paul's mentioned essential civilian demand. There's a key word in that. It's not essential. It's not civilian. It's demand. You have to demand this. This is what Paul is trying to get you to wake up to. Paul is trying to get you to understand that there's already a protocol in place that if we demand it, hemp cannabis, it becomes immediately legal. All of these other gyrations that we're going through, we don't need to be doing. Each state doesn't need to vote for legalization. We don't have to wait for the government's approval for farmers to grow it. All we have to do is demand this as essential, as Paul's pointed out, for 25 years.
Exactly. And people can find my book, Cannabis versus Climate Change, on Amazon. They can find my film by the same name on Vimeo. And I think it's really important that people recognize that while there is a lot of heavy news, there are a lot of really hopeful notes in the message. And I hope people hang in there through the heaviness of UVB radiation and all the dangers that it poses, to the good news about regenerating the atmospheric aerosols and availing ourselves of these really, really just invaluable gifts of the great, you name it, the Creator. You can Google global broiling to find my writing. You can hopefully look up the blog for the California Cannabis Ministry, which is an individual secular spiritual process that empowers people to embrace their individual spirituality and perhaps incorporate cannabis nutrition or ingestion of one form or another into that process. I find it to be tremendously valuable.
And if anyone doesn't remember anything else, reach out to me and I will make sure that you get a hold of Paul. You can reach out to me through thejustlovemovement.com, or you can go to find me on Facebook, and I'll be more than happy to direct you to Paul. Paul, my dear friend, and again, I can't thank you enough for everything that you've been doing for the past 25 years. Thank you for coming on the Just Love Show on WLOR.net. W-Rock, and keep up the good fight, my friend. Thank you again. And thank you for joining me.
And we'll stay on the healing track together, Kip.
Great. And we're going to end the show tonight with Paul's music selection of Jackson Browne. And what was the title of that song, Paul? I Am a Patriot, I believe?
I am a patriot. I'm a global patriot.
Love you, brother. I'll talk to you soon.
The river opens for the righteous, and the river opens for the righteous. And the river opens for the righteous, and the river opens for the righteous, and the river opens for the righteous someday. I was walking with my brother, and he wondered what's on my mind. I said what I believe in my soul ain't what I see with my eyes, and we can't turn our back this time. I am a patriot, and I love my country, because my country is all I know. I wanna be with my family, people who understand me. I've got nowhere else to go. And the river opens for the righteous, and the river opens for the righteous, and the river opens for the righteous someday. And I was talking with my sister, she looked so fine. I said, baby, what's on your mind? She said, I want to run like the lion, released from the cages, released from the rages, burning in my heart tonight. Yeah. And I ain't no communist, and I ain't no capitalist. and I love my country, because my country is all I know. And the river opens for the righteous, and the river opens for the righteous, and the river opens for the righteous someday.